Once upon a time, there were 4 kingdoms. There was the kingdom of Great Britain, the kingdom of France, the kingdom of Bohemia, and the kingdom of Bavaria. And then there was a bunch of other kingdoms. Okay, so those are different kinds of kingdoms. So once upon a time, it was thought that there were 4 kingdoms of organisms besides prokaryotes. And remember, the prokaryotes were thought to be just bacteria. Now we know that prokaryotes include archaea. And we also know, we'll see in a bit, but that there's 3 domains, and one of them is eukarya. Anyway, the 4 kingdoms were thought to be what are called protists, single-celled eukaryotes, and then plants, animals, and fungi. Okay, but this is before the advent of DNA sequencing and modern methods of phylogenetic classification. So things have changed. First of all, let's take a look at this. So in the protists, these are considered single-cell eukaryotes. The thing is, the kingdom protist is an artificial grouping defined by what members of this group are not. They are not plants, they're not animals, they're not fungi, they're not bacteria, and they're not archaeans. So what are they? Well, they're single-cell eukaryotes, but here's the common ancestor of eukaryotes. And we can see that there are all different kinds of single-celled eukaryotes. Okay? There are diplomonads, euglenoids, ciliates, branalgae, foraminifera, then a bunch of different kinds of algae. And there's some other ones that aren't shown up here. And then there are, at the same taxonomic level, plants, animals, and fungi. Oh, and some other protists, including amoebas. And it turns out that all these different protists would have to be their own kingdoms to make sense phylogenetically in terms of how they're related to each other. So there's 2 main groups of protists, including the ones that include plants, which are actually over in this group right here with the green algae. And then there's another group, so this is all this group, right, including the plants. And then there's this completely other different group that includes amoebas, slime molds, fungi, and animals. And it turns out that fungi and animals are more closely related to each other using this phylogenetic tree than they are to either of them are to plants. Okay, so in fact, in the old days, they used to, there's something called botany, which is the study of plants and fungi, because they thought fungi and plants are similar. They both are, they don't move around, and they both stand straight up. And fungi release spores, plants release seeds and things like that. And they were more similar, but they're not. And animals and and fungi are more closely related. Okay, so this whole idea of four kingdoms is something from the past that doesn't really work anymore. We'd actually have to see a phylogeny, we will in a second, that actually shows more like what it is. And then all these other groups like ciliates are monophyletic. Okay? Okay. Now, in the old classification system that you guys learned about, for example, with animals, one thing, animals are what are called a monophyletic group. That means they contain the ancestor and all the subsequent descendants that make up that lineage. Plants are also monophyletic. Fungi are monophyletic. Okay, so in animals, in the old classification system, we had kingdom, we had animals. There's a kingdom called animals, but it's not exactly in a perfect hierarchy anymore. And then there were animals, there's phylum. So in terms of humans, we're animals, animalia. We're in chordates, which are a kind of animal. We're mammals in a class. We're primates in an order. We're hominidae in a family. And then in genus, we have our own genus plus a bunch of extinct things. Okay? This is an old classification system. This is how things used to be classified. And of course, nowadays, when we have a species, we give a genus name and a species name, like Homo sapiens. Okay. Now, in reality, there are three domains that we've talked about previously. And the domain is the biggest or highest, most inclusive hierarchical group or organization of life. And there are three domains. First of all, there's a common ancestral cell. We don't know much about that because there's none around today. And then we've got bacteria, okay? And then we've got a different lineage. That was the ancestor of archaea and eukarya. Though now there might be just two domains, which are archaea and then one branch led to eukaryotes. But for now we'll have three. And the eukaryotes, of course, are the ones that have cells with nucleus and organelles, and the other two don't have that. Okay. So, now we've kind of covered of evolutionary trees. For example, this is a phylogenetic tree, a quick review that shows some of the vertebrates, not all of them, but sharks and rays, which don't have bones. They're not bony fish. Rayfin fish, which are bony fish, and then the tetrapods that are derived from those. And of course, this is how time goes that way. Okay, and then these are various features that are unique to groups. So all of these are vertebrates. Bony skeleton. Now the tetrapods, right? And then finally, amniotic egg. Okay. So you get the idea. And the same thing here, and this is exactly the same thing. It's just structured in a different way, but it's still in this way. Time goes this way. And by the way, in the fossil record, sharks show up around the same time as ray fin fish. These other fish, like coelacanth and lungfish, show up a little bit later. The tetrapods really don't show up until the early Devonian, and and then of course things like mammals don't show up until the Jurassic. Lizards and snakes about the same time. Okay. So evolutionary trees show the actual evolutionary relationships about when things showed up in terms of when things evolved. And then they can be aged based on the fossils and also some statistical techniques on similarity of the DNA. And these are extant. And then, of course, when we're dealing with fossils, we don't have DNA necessarily. We usually don't. Okay, so to get a look at evolutionary trees, just to go over it, there's something called a clade. That's kind of like a kingdom was a clade, the animal kingdom. That means a branch of the evolutionary tree with the given ancestor, and all its descendants make up a specific clade. In other words, for example, Archaeopteryx and all subsequent animals that evolved from it, those were the birds. A node marks the point, and we'll look at this in a second, where one ancestor group split or diverged into two separate ones, and it represents the most recent common ancestor, the most immediate ancestor, and then a lineage is a descent. It's depicted as a branch. So let's take a look. Okay. So, first of all, we're going to show these are some large clades. For example, here are the mammals. And there are three main groups within that mammals. And mammals, of course, are defined as having fur and mammary glands. And they're the monotremes, the egg-laying mammals, marsupials, and the placental mammals. The mammals are also part of amniota. That means, and amniotes include turtles, lizards and snakes, crocodiles, birds, and it doesn't show here, but dinosaurs. So, and these are called reptiles. Okay. Oops. There we go. And then there's amphibians, also another clade. And then different fish, which are the ancestors, the lobe-finned fish of all the tetrapods. So each branch is a lineage, in this case placental mammals. Okay, so we've got a clade that includes a whole bunch of different groups that make up that clade, and they all have a common ancestor, right? They are part of, let's say, a larger clade. So mammals and reptiles are part of the amniota. Okay, and they have common ancestor. And the amniotes are part of tetrapods, which also include frogs and salamanders. And then we finally get back to the most recent common ancestor of all these groups, which are the Sacarpagia, which are a group of kind of fish, bony fish. Okay? And we can see this, we go from left to right in terms of old to recent. So this is called tree thinking, and these are terminology. And these, by the way, the tips are the present groups that are still around today. That's why with the reptiles, it doesn't show the dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs, but that's the only lineage left over from the dinosaurs. Okay? And then the nodes, common nodes, tetrapods, amniotes, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and so forth. Okay. So, how do we tell if species are related to each other? Okay, so normally we try to show a divergence between two lineages, but here we've got, first of all, we've got vertebral column. All of these taxa, turtles, which are one of the main groups of the reptiles, and then the mammals, platypus, which is a marsupial, kangaroo, which is kangaroo is a marsupial, platypus is a monotreme. They lay eggs, and then beavers, which are placental mammals like ourselves. Okay, so we know that all of this group has a vertebral column. There's others that aren't shown here, including fish, but we're just going to go from at least some of the reptiles. Okay. So then we have to map on what do platypus, kangaroo, and beavers have in common. They've got two things. They've got hair, and they've got mammary glands. Okay? So all these three are mammals. But there's further that we can go in actually mapping character traits and seeing how things happen. So remember, by the way, we're going this way in time. So now, okay. So first of all, let's so vertebral column and egg laying. Egg laying was the ancestral thing, not carrying around offspring. Then for mammals, the next thing was hair and mammary glands. So all of these have mammary glands. Well, platypus kind of, but they all make milk. Then we go from a loss of eggs to live-bearing young. Okay, so here's live-bearing young. Okay. And then finally, we go to Metatheria. These are the marsupials, and they have a pouch. Or we have those that are placental. Okay? So these are now Metatheria or marsupials and Eutheria, placentals, share a most recent common ancestor. Okay? And that was before they split into two different groups. So here we go. We can see these again. Okay. So this is a phylogenetic tree. And we can show phylogenies in all kinds of different ways. This way. In general, we show it this way. Common ancestor, nodes. Here's a node between A and B, has the most recent common ancestor. Oh, time goes this way. There's an older, most recent common ancestor for A, B, and C, right? There's a more recent common ancestor for D and E. And then there's a common ancestor, finally, all the way back in time for all of these. Okay. You can also show it this way. Show it this way. Okay. Now, again, here's the three domains again. Okay, so we have a most recent common ancestor. We have the bacteria. We have the archaea, the common ancestor for archaea and eukarya. And then in the eukarya, we have actually plants are down here. Animals and fungi kind of make a clade. And then there's another big clade of plants and ciliates and all these other ones. Okay. Okay. So biological diversity biodiversity is a variety of all world's living things, past and present, including extinct forms. And it includes interactions of all the living things with each other and the ecosystem, and that's called ecology, which we'll study later. And the biodiversity can be described at different levels, including genes, like the nucleotides, cells, tissue types, organs, species, or groups, or entire ecosystems. There's a universal ancestor, of course. Everything has DNA. And all living organisms at this point look like it's descended from a common hypothetical ancestor, and they all share something in common, which is the DNA, and they all have life except for viruses. Okay. So why is there so much biodiversity? Well, we've kind of gone over this with evolution. In other words, there's speciation. Okay? And a lot of the speciation is because of evolution by natural selection, as well as the other forces that we covered, like mutation, genetic drift, and things like that. And also, in terms of biodiversity, extinction. Extinction was a big, major player in the groups that we see that are still around today, and groups that are now no longer around and have no direct descendants. Okay. So in terms of time and in terms of when things arose, we know that the first organisms were the simplest organisms. And there was an ancestor of both bacteria and archaea. They were prokaryotes. Remember, prokaryotes don't have a nucleus or organelles. But it turns out that archaea is actually more closely related to eukaryotes, even though archaea is a prokaryote, than either are to bacteria. Okay, so this is kind of, prokaryotes are in fact not a real group, because in terms of phylogenetics, real evolutionary relationships, archaea and eukarya share more in common. True, eukarya have a nucleus and organelles, and archaea don't, but they share a bunch of proteins that are more similar to each other than to bacteria. Prokaryotes appeared on Earth at least 3.7 billion years ago, maybe more. About 2.8 billion years ago, photosynthetic bacteria evolved and began producing oxygen as a waste byproduct. And the descendants of those photosynthetic bacteria are cyanobacteria that are still around today. Okay, so for example, we have bacteria, one group of bacteria first. Here's the common ancestor. There's eubacteria, and then there's the group that led to not only archaea, but also to all the eukaryotes. So this is the node right here for the ancestor of all eukaryotes. And then we can see, in terms of the different eukaryotes, we have one branch that leads to all of these, including the chromaviola, two groups of those, the rhizaria, and then the archaeoplastids that also include chlorophytes, which include also all the plants. Okay? And then there was another group, and then the excavata over here. Okay. And then there's a whole nother group, and that is the group that includes amoebas, and then fungi and animals. Okay? Okay. So, as oxygen in the atmosphere increased, the first single-celled eukaryotes evolved. Roughly 650 million years ago or so, we don't really know exactly, larger, more complex eukaryotes started to evolve. And then dinosaurs, we'll get to that in a bit. These were photosynthetic, and there were a few others that also are photosynthetic. So this is, again, life's timeline. We've kind of gone over this. Liquid water on Earth, the first oceans, the origin of life, probably in this area around 3.8 billion years ago. Around there. And that include the first ancestors of bacteria, the first evidence of photosynthetic cells, right around this period of time, about 3.5 billion years ago. First evidence of oxygenic photosynthesis, relying on oxygen, or giving off oxygen. And finally, the first cyanobacteria. We still have those around. The first eukaryotic fossils, maybe 2 billion years ago. For the photosynthetic eukaryotes, there are a number of those that we went back. And then finally, first red algae. This is still the Proterozoic. And then finally, the late Proterozoic, maybe 600 million years ago, we start to see plants, fungi, and even the first animals. Okay? Okay. So, again, to the major events, the Precambrian, which includes the Proterozoic, the Archean, the Hadrian, all that. Life begins. We don't know exactly what it's like. things don't really get going until just before the Cambrian explosion right here. Okay, and a lot of the major lineages of animals actually show up within about 30 million years. Before then, in the Ediacaran, just before that, there's some animals, but they're much more simple. Okay. So I want you to look at some animation that we can get to in, you go to, I want you to look at the animation from chapter 14. It's mass extinctions in the history of life. At this point, we're going to get to mass extinctions later. But it gives you a little overview on the history of life, some of the stuff we still covered. Okay, so very early life, of course, grows probably in water. Seems like at least although life on Earth requires water, it's a universal solvent. Only unicellular life, and through the most of the Precambrian until the very end of it. At one point, there have been some glaciation. Of course, we're familiar with the more recent ones, like when the mammoths were around, but very early on, there were some really extensive glaciations all the way to the equator, and so it was called the snowball Earth, and this probably happened a number of different times. And we're not exactly sure what life was like then, but obviously life was still, it didn't go extinct. Okay. The first multicellular animals, mostly probably sponges that appear in the fossil record 580 million years ago, but even 700 million, there's some evidence that early animals were around. The Cambrian explosion really led to the establishment of all the major lineages of life and a whole bunch of different guilds, from herbivores that ate plants and things like that, and bacteria, to animals that consumed or were eating herbivores that were eating those lower forms of life. Okay. Plants evolved from green algae. The thing is, before plants made it to land, they hadn't really been plants. They were mainly green algae. And there might have been some plants that were living in the water itself. Okay? But they actually made it. So if we actually look at this. So chlorophyta are the first. They're green algae. And all plants, they have chlorophyll A and B. And then all plants subsequently inherit those. And then bunches of things start happening. Plasmodesmata, which allow the exchange of gases. A cuticle that keeps the plant from drying out. Multicellular embryo, stomata, vascular tissue. So these are more complex plants. Things like ferns and allies that have vascular tissue, but they don't have seeds. And then finally seeds, fruits, and flowers with the angiosperm. And they don't show up. All these things, from liverworts, or even here, show up in the Ordovician, the first plants, the first colonization of plants of the terrestrial biome. In other words, the land. So, and the key innovations, of course, when they actually colonized the land, and you'll see this with other animals as well, I mean, with other organisms as well, including animals and fungi. When you leave water, then you've got to confront um, the possibility of drying out, and so you need things to stop that from happening. And plants developed a number of different things, a waterproof cuticle, so that they could retain their water that they need, a vascular system that carries water and other nutrients up and down to the rest of the plant, different kinds of tissue for support. This is cellulose, form of carbohydrate, specialized reproductive structures, spore producing, and then seeds and flowers and things like that, and all that. So these are all things that eventually evolved on land to help plants, that allowed plants to really diversify and cover the earth. So you can see all these different kinds of plants, many different things. Okay, by the way, plants are autotrophs. They make their own food through photosynthesis, namely carbohydrates, and they form the basis of the whole terrestrial food chain. And then there are phytoplankton, which are single-cell organisms that also use photosynthesis to make carbohydrates. Now, the fungi also colonized land about the same period of time. The Ordovician from 450. Now, there were fungi well before this living in water. They might have even started colonizing the land 500 million years ago, but we don't really know. It's possible. They really colonized in the Ordovician, and then there were what are called, in the ocean. Fungi are heterotrophs. That means they have to consume things like plants or photosynthetic phytoplankton to get at the carbohydrates that they can then break down. Okay? So these are absorptive heterotrophs. And they actually, like we think of animals, things go into a gut, get digested and all that. With the cilia of fungi, they actually engulf things that are either alive or dead. And then animals are multicellular eukaryotes, just like fungi and plants. They're ingestive heterotrophs. That means they usually consume other things and digest them inside. And they obtain energy and carbon from ingesting food and digesting it, that are heterotrophs. Possibly that they first evolved 700 million years ago, but there's not really much evidence to support that completely. And they're descended from a flagellated common ancestor that are related to fungi called choanoflagellates. Okay. The earliest, the most simple animals that we've ever found, and the earliest fossils, are sponges. And they don't really have tissue. They have all these cells that kind of are all very similar to each other and are colonial in some respects, but they do form a complete multicellular organism. Then we start seeing things like cnidarians that had, so sponges had no symmetry. Cnidarians had radial symmetry. big change was bilateral symmetry. And this included all things that had bilateral symmetry. So radial symmetry, we'll look at in a second, but let's say you had something like this. You could cut it any different way, and you'd get equal halves. Okay, that's radial. But bilateral, you have a head region, and then you can only have one plane that you can split in half where you get mirror images. And that really started the differentiation of a lot of different animals. And in animals, we have all kinds of different animals, flatworms that are very simple. Also, cnidarians and flatworms have only 2 layers of tissue, whereas everything else that we show here has 3 layers of tissue: endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. There's mollusks, including clams, snails, all that, and also cephalopods like squid and things like that. Worms, nematodes, arthropods, including insects and crustaceans, and then a whole different group that led to echinoderms, which include sea stars, and also chordates, vertebrates, and that's us. Okay, so, and also all these are called protostomes, and then this group right here called deuterostomes. So they grow, the protostomes grow from mouth first to anus, and the deuterostomes grow from anus to mouth first. Okay, so first of all, there were, before the Cambrian explosion, which was right here, okay, so before that happened, there were some fossils that have been found that suggest that they might have been the very earliest of animals. For example, the Doshanto fossils right here show perhaps early embryos, okay? And then the Ediacaran fossils up until 565 million years ago, started to show perhaps some of the very small earliest, even animals that have bilateral symmetry, perhaps. But they were few and far between, and it didn't look like there was anything like predators running around or anything like that. It wasn't until the Cambrian that things really diversified, and a good example is the Burgess Shale. So, environmental change, increase in oxygen levels, this probably makes multicellularity possible. There were more ecological opportunities, including niche differentiation. We'll get to those later. And then animals started developing developmental genes and much more complex body plans with the evolution of Hox genes. So, in the Cambrian, from 542 million years ago until about 500 million years ago, all the major lineages of animals appeared on the fossil record, including some that are no longer with us. Okay. So this is an illustration of the Cambrian explosion, including the Burgess Shale, which is some fossils of soft-bodied animals that don't fossilize well, but in this case they did, found up in Canada in the Canadian Rockies in British Columbia. There's also earlier Ediacaran animals that were simpler that have been found elsewhere in Australia and a few other places. And then the Cambrian showed everything from, these are all animals, even though they're sessile, right? They can't move around. But then there were a lot of animals that were bilateral symmetry like this, and like these guys, and these guys, the major predator, worms, all kinds of different things. A lot of things that perhaps were arthropods, like insects and crustaceans and spiders, but this is all under the ocean, so they were marine animals, nothing on land. If we go back, mollusks are, so symmetry. Okay. So it looks like there were different kinds of animals. Okay. So sponges aside, there were a lot of animals that have radial symmetry, like the sea anemone, where you can cut them any plane, all different kinds of planes of symmetry. Whereas in bilateral, let's say this fish, there's only one plane of symmetry. So there's a ventral side, dorsal side, anterior end, that's the front, posterior end, the rear. Radial symmetry doesn't have that kind of symmetry. Okay? The body of an animal can be spliced symmetrically along any number of vertical planes versus only two. Another big thing in animals was segmentation. That means different parts could be specialized for different functions. Okay? So, like you had claws, you also had antenna for sensing the world. You had specialized mouth parts. Okay? You had parts for locomotion. So all these segments allowed specialization in terms of function. And usually there's a head, thorax, and abdomen, and then the head includes a lot of sensory organs, including, in this case, antenna, but also eyes, perhaps a sense of smell, like we have, perhaps hearing, that back, kind of stuff. So, chordates, now, not all chordates have a backbone. That, in other words, vertebrates. Vertebrates came along a little bit later, so let's take a look. The first, they all have a notochord. That means all the way, now, these sea squirts don't seem like they do, but the larvae actually have a notochord that then is lost. Okay? So they have a nerve cord. All of these things have a nerve cord. But it's not until you get a skull and a backbone where you actually have vertebrates. Okay? And then finally, you have lampreys, and hagfish, which don't have jaws. Then finally, jawed fish like sharks and rays, rayfin fish, coelacanths, and then finally the tetrapods. So, include all animals with backbones. Those are called vertebrates. Include all animals with a notochord but no backbones. And some of these are invertebrates. But there's other invertebrates that we... Let's take a look. The amniotic egg, which includes dinosaurs and mammals, that was a major event in terms of colonizing land, because it meant that, unlike the amphibians, which had to stay near water, all these animals actually could venture away from water. Okay. Now, and then so at least 450 million years ago, the first animals colonized land, but they were not vertebrates. The vertebrates didn't really show up until the Devonian 390 million years ago, so these guys were here first. And they included arthropods, crustaceans, spiders, and mollusks. So land animals emerged first during the Ordovician or Silurian, I think, 450 million years ago. The first terrestrial vertebrates, tetrapods, evolved from loaphing fish in the Devonian 390 to 400 million years ago. Amphibians had traits in addition to legs that permitted them to move onto land. These are all early tetrapods that we kind of went over earlier. They were the dominant organisms for 100 million years. Then about 356 million years ago, reptiles first showed up. And in other words, amniotes. And so animals could start colonizing areas of the land where there was not much less water. And they were the first to develop an amniotic egg, and that included reptiles and synapsids that led to mammals. Okay, so here's the amniotic egg. This was a big deal. You could now lay an egg away from water, unlike with amphibians. And it had an embryo, a yolk sac for a food and energy supply, a thing to waste products, an amnion, a chorion for gas exchange, and then a shell around it to protect everything. Okay. So, for amphibians and fish, they have gelatinous eggs that need to be close or in water. Okay. Now, the dinosaurs didn't actually show up. The first reptiles showed up 350 million years ago, okay? But the dinosaurs didn't really show up until after the largest mass extinction, which was during the Permian mass extinction 250 million years ago. And about 20 million years after that, there's fossils of perhaps the first dinosaurs, okay? And then there were multiple different groups. Quadruped dinosaurs, there were tetrapods, a lot of meat eaters, and out of these tetrapods right here, theropods, including Deinonychus and Tyrannosaurus rex and raptors and things like that. One group was the aves. and this gave rise finally to birds. And all the different modern birds, and then finally a completely different group led to mammals. So mammals were over here, and then the major group that led to right here, these included archosaurs that included birds and crocodiles. Okay. And these are the dinosaurs that finally gave rise to birds. Okay. Now, dinosaurs, they're all different sizes. In fact, many of them are very, very small. Okay. Theropods were one group. They were bipedal. Okay. Most were carnivorous, but there were some that were insectivorous and some that were even herbivores or omnivores too. They ate all kinds of different things. Some could actually swim and eat fish. Others boasted large scales. Many had feathers. Okay? Feathers. A lot of them had feathers. So feathers evolved before birds showed up. The first birds show up in the early Jurassic, about 125 million years ago, and they are a group of theropod dinosaurs. They ran on two legs. They had hollow, thin-walled bones, but it turns out a lot of theropods did. And birds are, of course, the only dinosaurs that survived the end Cretaceous mass extinction 65 million years ago, when the asteroid hit and wiped out almost 90% of all. So some of the things we've discovered are like a feathered dinosaur tail with there's a small dinosaur that was trapped in amber. Amber is the resin, like the pitch that you see on pine trees, very sticky. We usually find lots of insects in amber that have been fossilized, but this is an example of a dinosaur tail, including the bones and then the feathers. And it's only until the last 20 years that we started to actually find dinosaur fossils that were definitely dinosaurs that had feathers. These dinosaurs could not fly.
Appeared as dinosaurs evolved from their earliest ancestors. It is by using the sequence in which those characteristics appear that we reconstruct the history of life. Gautier found that dinosaurs and crocodiles parted ways 240 million years ago, when the ancestors of dinosaurs evolved the ability to stand up and run with their legs straight under their bodies. As the family branched out, the meat-eaters called theropods became more and more bird-like, acquiring traits like a three-toed foot, a three-fingered hand, a wishbone, and many others. Each new feature was passed along to the descendants. Finally, a branch led in one direction to Deinonychus, and in the other to Archaeopteryx and birds. With birds nested at the top of the dinosaur tree, linked to their ancestors by hundreds of inherited traits, Gautier says there can be no doubt about the family ties.
Birds are dinosaurs.
That's why they look like dinosaurs. And some dinosaurs looked like birds. We now know there's one detail the makers of Jurassic Park got wrong. The raptors should have had feathers. The fossils from China proved it.